For me and for most artists, it's very personal when I'm making my art. I'm not thinking this is an act of service for the world. I'm thinking I'm in so much pain right now and I don't know what to do with it. So I have to write a poem about it.
If it was trauma dumping, sometimes it's a fine line, I imagine. But what I saw was a distinct shift from this external observational poetry to deeply personal.
It's different with poetry versus novel writing. Writing my novel, there's a level of discipline that had to be there. Like I had to sit there every day for an hour and muscle through. Otherwise the characters would get stale and the story would get stale and I would lose the pulse. With a poem, I'm a lot more lenient. Like I can get the skeleton and I can let it go, and I almost feel like the poem will season and ferment while I'm off living my life, and then I can come back to it.
Allie Michelle.
Adam Roa.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for coming on the Creative Path podcast. I appreciate that.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Yeah. And it's funny because I'm just going to name the part of me that feels a little awkward sometimes. I feel a little awkward when I meet people that I go, wow, I don't know you at all, but I really feel like I know you because of the depth of the art that you share. And the resonance I have with that, because so much of how you share as a poet, one with 3 published poetry books and a novel that's coming out, which we'll talk about, you are someone who seems to share from a place of human, really deep human. And I respect that about you. And so bear with me as my nerves settle, but I deeply appreciate the work that you do, and thank you for coming on the show today.
Thank you. I feel the exact same way on all accounts. Like I generally am kind of awkward, but I always feel like an honest awkward is way better than a dishonest cool. So we'll stumble through this together. But I've respected your work for so many years, so this is a treat.
Thank you. Yeah, 2 poets. We're just sitting and having a conversation around creativity, and I'll start right there. I would love to know how you relate to your creativity. How do you? For me, I personify my creativity a lot of times through a relationship with a muse, and I'm just curious how you relate to yours.
My creativity is my celebration of life. It's the reason my life is so vivid, because I have to feel everything really honestly and deeply. Otherwise, my art is pretty terrible, and my art is kind of my way of like making an offering to the world. I almost want to call it a spiritual practice, but I know that can come with, a certain image around it. But that is my way of staying devoted and staying alive and in real time with the world. And so for me, it's a lifeline. Yeah.
And when you say a lifeline, could you say it's a way of staying devoted? Mm-hmm. And that word came up when I had Blue on, and we had a conversation about this, because to me, the act of devotion, what are you in devotion to through your creativity? What are you staying devoted to?
I'm staying devoted to whatever that higher creative force is that expresses itself through me. And so I made a shift about 8 months ago to stop creating for an audience and instead make an offering. Because I think all art is really saying the same thing, just I understand at its best. That's what it makes people feel, is understood and seen.
And do you think that the artist is consciously aware of that while they're creating it? Or do you think that is the audience receiving that and feeling understood, but the artist, is that an intention to help people feel understood? Is it part of your intention, or is that just kind of the byproduct of authentic expression?
I think for me and for most artists, it's very personal when I'm making my art. I'm not thinking this is an act of service for the world. I'm thinking I'm in so much pain right now and I don't know what to do with it. So I have to write a poem about it in order to understand and listen and express and transmute it. And so it's incredibly personal. And ironically, because of that, it tends to relate to a lot of people, because the human experience is a universal one. Mm-hmm. Hey, bud.
Saren, do you need attention? So I would relate to that. I often say it as my creativity, my creative process is for me. Mm-hmm. I actually don't create my art for anyone else. Mm-mm. But I do find that the sharing of it, the moment I've shared it, it's now no longer mine. I've released it out into the world. It's left the nest, so to speak. And how long have you had a pretty large, I mean, relative, like, I don't know when you consider it large, but when would you say that your social media really took off?
I was about 18. I was really, really young.
How old are you now?
26.
26. Okay.
Yeah. And so it was incredibly disorienting. At first it took off because I was doing travel journalism, like where to eat, stay, sleep, just that whole influencer thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then I transitioned into yoga and the poetry and stuff like that. So it's been there, but I think it took me a long time to figure out what I actually wanted to do with it.
So was your travel sort of lifestyle stuff, was that always, I mean, did you have poetic captions? Were you always expressing yourself in that way?
I've always loved writing. That's always been a huge part of my life. But, I didn't dare call myself a writer until much later. And the poetry, I've been writing poetry since I was 10 or 11 years old. I've always loved it. But I didn't know you could make a career out of it. I thought that was a class you sleep through in English. And then Rupi Kaur blew up, and I started to see all of these other incredible poets like Rudy Francisco. And I realized, oh, this is actually possible. People do this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so then you wrote a book of poetry. I mean, you've written 3 now, and it just exploded. Did it take it? It took off. Is that correct to say?
Yeah, it definitely took off. And honestly, part of that is timing. If I'm being really, really honest, I think there's a lot of incredible poets that go unseen. Instagram, it was so much easier to grow back then, and people just were looking to follow people. So I always tell artists, like, you have to separate your work from the commercial industry, because Instagram and social media, it's kind of like a lottery. And I don't know if you experienced this, but you're posting, you have no idea how things will do. Something goes viral, it's probably the thing you didn't expect would, but you have to just keep showing up and buying your ticket every day. And it's not a reflection of your worth as an artist. So I don't even think that book was necessarily worth exploding in the way that it did personally. But it opened a door for a lifelong devotional practice with poetry.
How did that happen? So when you released this book, and tell me a little bit about the process of creating the book to begin with, because I haven't yet released my first book of poetry. I've been working on it for years, because it's not simply going to be a collection of my poems. There's narrative woven into it. It's just this really interesting expression for myself. And so it's taken me quite a long time. And I have 3 months carved out this year to finish it. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious, your process as someone who's released 3 books of poetry, when you went into that first one, what did that look like?
I had no idea what I was doing. I self-published it on Kindle Direct, and I found an artist, and we uploaded it on Amazon, and I pressed go. And, luckily at the time I had a podcast, and so I had a pretty engaged community that was interested in writing and listening in that way. And so it really grew and evolved massively. And then from there, it hit the bestseller list, and Andrews McMeel reached out, and they were like, hey, we'd love to purchase this and do your next book. And so it kind of...
And so when you approach the creative process to it, so did you start with a concept? Did you start just by taking the poetry that felt most relevant to you? How did you determine what the book actually was going to be as a finished product?
That's changed a lot over the years, but for that first one, I was living in Kauai at the time in a really remote area. I mean, I could go 2 weeks without seeing people if I wanted. There was nothing to do but stare at a rock and observe nature. And so a lot of that poetry was more existential in what I was learning from just observing the natural world around me. And I think in terms of the story of it, I don't really write poems thinking, oh, this will go in a poetry collection that's about this. I just write the poems that are honest. And from there, once I compile them together, I can kind of see what the through line is, like the main things I write about, the main things I'm struggling with. And I can extract a story and build the book around that. Whereas with a novel, you have to kind of plot the whole thing from start to finish if you want to do Easter eggs and actually have a writing process that's in flow. So it's a very opposing process for me with poetry.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And so how often do you write poetry?
Anytime I feel something really strongly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Is that wind up being, do you go long periods without writing it? Do you find that you're writing poetry on a weekly basis? There's a poem coming out of you. How's that look for you?
I think the times that I've gone the longest without it have been the times I'm disconnected from myself. Because if I'm actually in my heart and I'm really paying attention and I'm really feeling my feelings in real time, there's always something to write about. But I also don't nickel and dime myself anymore. I'm not like, I wrote 3 or 4 poems this week. Look at me.
Well, you said that you 8 months ago shifted out of creating or writing for an audience in any way. And so I'm curious where that shifted for you to begin with, because it sounds like you were just writing your own poetry, and then at a certain point you decided to make a book, and it exploded beyond what you thought it was going to do. And in some ways sounds like you don't even think it was worthy of that, but it did. And so obviously it was. And then somewhere you started creating for the audience. Is that true?
Not necessarily. It was just more personal. Whereas now I try to just not vomit my pain into my work and actually create an offering of hope as well. Because for me, there was one book where I really was just in excruciating pain and trying to work out my trauma. And so I feel like I kind of trauma dumped in my poetry. And that was a progression from the first book, because it wasn't these existential concepts that I hadn't lived yet that I was just recycling. I say that book's kind of like if Dr. Seuss and Alan Watts had a baby a little bit. That's how it feels to me. And the second one was so human. It was so open. It was so raw. But I feel like it was a little trauma dumpy and like almost too personal, where, you know, it was losing the relatability to everyone. And so with the next one, I wanted it to feel empowering and honoring of the full human experience, because that's something I really struggle with seeing in the world right now, is this sort of apathetic state and disconnection. And I think art is one of the main and quickest ways to bring someone back to their heart. So I'd say it kind of went from like head to heart, and now it's like full body.
Interesting.
Yeah.
You know, my journey has taken an interesting parallel to that, where so I don't have any books, but I have 2 spoken word poetry albums. And the first one's called Permission, and it's tracks on that. No More War, Water is Life, which I wrote during Standing Rock. And these concepts that were very meta, they're very macro. And that was even I toured a show with that poetry. And suddenly I went through a breakup after 10 years with someone, and my poetry became deeply personal. It became a way for me to process what was happening internally instead of just processing what I was seeing externally. And I don't know if it was trauma dumping. Sometimes it's a fine line, I imagine. But what I saw was a distinct shift from this external observational poetry to deeply personal inner world. And so now I think I merge those more, just kind of naturally. It's not an intentional thing, but it's an interesting parallel. And I wonder how many people go on that same journey. Would you say that was reflected in what you were experiencing personally in your personal growth?
Yeah, and I do want to say, I don't mean to say it's wrong to trauma dump, because also sometimes your art is the only thing with arms large enough to wrap around your suffering. And that's a really healthy way to transmute it. And so I think there's just some seasons where you come to it with pain, and then you come to it with offering, and it really just depends. But what we're talking about almost reminds me of, have you seen Good Will Hunting?
Mm-hmm.
You know that scene where Robin Williams is like, you could quote me a sonnet, but you have no idea what it's like to be devastated by a great love. You know? And he kind of goes in all of these things of, you could tell me about this, but you haven't lived this. And I think that's a really natural journey for an artist. At first, we're borrowing the voices of the people around us. We're reading about these different concepts, but it hasn't settled in our bones yet. And I think that's the beauty of being an artist, is we're like wine. We only get better with age, because we only get more experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I 100% agree. I think that as an artist, I'm pulling from what I know and what I've lived and what I'm borrowing. Yeah. And I think that I describe it as creating the most impactful art is created from the edges of our consciousness, the edges of what we can feel, what we know to be true or believe to be true, the edges of ourselves. And so as we expand ourselves, we expand the depths that our art can go. And so when you said you wanted your third book to be really more empowering, right? Was your poetry naturally that then? Or did you decide, I want to do a third book, so I'm going to start writing more empowering poetry?
No, I can't really approach things that way. I think that was an underlying intention of seeing certain artists and being like, okay, that's what I'm walking towards. Like, that's the energy that I'd like to bring to this. But I also didn't create that constriction around it. One of my dear friends, he's an incredible dancer. He does these beautiful improvs out of nowhere. We'll just be in a public space and a song will come on and he'll do a dance that looks so perfect. It's almost choreographed. And I once asked him, how do you do that? Do you have a vocabulary of movements you use and mix and match? And he's like, no, I'm listening to the music and the art is informing my movement. And so I feel like if I'm listening to life, it informs the poem.
Mm-hmm. And so how have you found that translation process to be most effective for you? Do you have a intentional practice of going in to write a poem? Is it just a moment of inspiration and suddenly you need to run to a journal? What does it actually look like?
I want your answer to this too, by the way, after. It starts with a really strong feeling, whether that's grief or ecstatic bliss or whatever it might be. And then I try to just get one really good line. And then from there, it starts to just, write itself, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And it just tumbles out.
It tumbles out.
Got it. And do you write poetry that, I think actually this would be great opportunity if you have a poem that feels relevant right now, to give you an opportunity to share one, because the way that you write, people can probably sense it in how you're speaking even right now. The way that you write is very different than the way that I write in terms of my poetry. And I would love to give people an opportunity to hear it as I'm about to ask you more questions about it.
Yeah.
So if you have a piece, please.
Okay. I'm not forgetting your answer, by the way. I think I'll do one that's more personal because we're talking about this. And I started going to the Poetry Lounge like 8 months ago. Have you been there?
I have, yeah.
Yeah. Incredible space. It feels like church to me. And I realized the poems that I was most touched by were the ones that were personal and that the artist was really moved by in their own words, even if I hadn't experienced that. So after the first time I went there, I came home and I wrote this. Hi, I'm Allie. My government name is Alexandra, which means protector of mankind. I know, my mother had high hopes for me with that one. But really my hope is just to get through the day without crushing myself under the weight of perfectionism, having an existential crisis, or running myself to the ground trying to make things that will make people love me. When I fall in love, it feels a little bit like leaping out of an airplane without a parachute. The view is so sweet. I forget that the ending will likely leave me broken, and yet I've rebuilt myself so many times I no longer fear crashing. I lean on my friends a little too heavy sometimes, and I'm learning that not every emotion needs to be analyzed by 4 people like it is a Harvard study on being human. When did self-growth become so self-centered? I don't need to be dissected, I just need to be. I'm told I'm baby-faced and look about 18 years old, and it used to bother me that I never seemed to be woman enough to be taken seriously, except now, being underestimated is my favorite superpower because no one can estimate how far I can go. No one can estimate how far you can go. I'm not a work in progress. I'm a work of art. Art is messy, imperfect, but honest. And isn't that our greatest reminder of what it means to be human? Hi, I'm Allie.
Snaps. Pure, the Poetry Lounge style. Thank you for sharing that. How's that feel to share?
Good. Feels good, actually. I was feeling nervous in this conversation, and I feel like that actually just kind of dropped me in my body a bit more. So,
Mm-hmm. I mean, hi, I'm Allie. You've just introduced yourself in such a vulnerable way and just the most authentic way you can, which is through your art and the voice of your art. So thank you for doing that. And so everyone, if you're hearing that, you can understand why I'm a fangirl. And also recognizing that your art is as if, I mean, it's a conversation with a poet. The way that you word things is so poetic. You do it just naturally, it seems like. And yet it's still somehow so conversational. And what I love about it is that's one of the biggest pieces of feedback I get about mine, actually, is people say, I don't even like poetry, but the way that you do it feels almost conversational. Mine tends to have rhyme to it most of the time and real cadence, maybe my hip hop like love growing up or something. But when you're approaching something like that, you come out of seeing someone else and you feel inspired to write something deeply personal. That was the impetus for that? Okay. And so now, what does that look like? Do you start by journaling? Because you said you're looking for one great line. What was the line of that? Is it the introduction of just your name? What is that?
I'm trying to remember what the first line was. I think I was really trying to reveal myself because in a lot of my work, you can hear the wisdom of my experience, but you can't feel me in the experience in the poem, if that makes sense. Like it's not that personal. It's about love or death or like a lot of different, existential concepts we all experience. So with that one, I was just trying to introduce myself of, if I really honestly were to reveal as much about myself as I can, what would that look like? And so it started being like, okay, hi, I'm Allie. And then my mom always I just thought that was such a funny thing to name me. She's like, yeah, that's what your name means. And I'm like, well, that's no pressure. And from there it was like, okay, what's the part of me that loves fiercely? What are my insecurities? What are my challenges? What are my strengths? And I just started weaving all of that in there.
And when you say weaving all of that in there, was each of those a separate exploration that you were doing? Like, were you doing it in a journal separately? And then you were bringing what you were learning about that exploration into the poem? Do you get what I'm saying?
I get what you're saying. I was looking at different aspects of myself and just writing them on the page. So it was like, okay, how do I behave in love? Great. I'll just leap out of the airplane and not really worry about the fall. What are my relationships like with my friends? What's my insecurity? Okay, it's being seen as like a young girl. Maybe I'll put that in there. And so there were different stanzas, I'd say, that I broke them up by because I was trying to really see what the honest core pieces are that I could reveal in the poem.
And so if I were to look at your poetry journal, for example, is it lines and arrows and yeah, it is?
It's so messy. Yeah,
got it.
It's really messy. It looks like just one of those whiteboards with all the math problems that are just,
Yeah, Goodwill Hunting.
Yeah, exactly.
Fully. Some of mine, if you were to look at my poetry journal, which is right over there, some of them are amazing because if I were to deliver it, it's 3+ minutes long, and yet there's maybe a few words just changed, so scratched out, but it comes out almost just as is. And then there's other ones that are absolute chicken scribble. And just when you look at it, it's very modular where I have a section of 8 and I'll draw a box around it and move the whole box over here with an arrow, and just it's piecing it together because the certain parts of it come through. And so while I'm writing a poem, there's this really interesting thing for me where I think the most powerful skill that a creative can develop, if it is a skill even at all, it's an inherent thing that I think we all have, which is to know when the creative muse is present and when it's left. Because there are times where I'll be sitting working on something and I know, because I can feel it, the muse is still here. So despite the fact that I'm really frustrated and I don't know where this goes and whatever, I'm going to sit in communion with the muse and allow this process to unfold and trust that it's going to go somewhere. And I think so many masterpieces have never been finished because people think that it's left, and so they abandon it when really it just needs more time. And then on the other side of that, I think some projects just lose what they could be because they're so frustrating because the muse has gone long ago and you're just banging your head against the wall thinking you need to power through and keep writing and finish it because you can tell that you're close to the end. But when I can feel that it's gone, I don't take that as a problem. I take that as a sign that, okay, I don't actually have the life in me yet. Whatever that is, maybe it's just another conversation. Maybe it's right now I'm just tired and I need to be in a fully energized space for that ending to come through. And so that skill of identifying the presence or absence of the muse, I think is one of the most powerful things that I share around creativity. And for you, do you relate to it in the same way, or do you have a different relationship to how a project or a poem even just goes from inception to being finished?
Well, I think that's really profound what you said about listening when the muse is there or isn't there, because people always ask that question. They're like, do I just keep my butt in the chair and muscle through, or is it about flow and letting it come and go? And so I think that's a really great barometer actually for artists to use. It's different with poetry versus novel writing. Writing my novel, there's a level of discipline that had to be there. Like I had to sit there every day for an hour and muscle through. Otherwise the characters would get stale and the story would get stale and I would lose the pulse. With a poem, I'm a lot more lenient. Like I can get the skeleton and I can let it go. And I almost feel like the poem will season and ferment while I'm off living my life, and then I can come back to it. So I have a lot more of a feminine approach with my poetry.
All right, family, I wanted to take a moment and remind you that if you are interested in the Artistic Entrepreneur Incubator, I encourage you to check the link in the description of this video because we are filling it up. If you are someone who has the heart of an artist and the mind of an entrepreneur, and you have a knowing that you could be great, you just need the community, the mentorship, the structure, the invitation into a space for you to actualize your greatness. If that is you, then right now, click the link and make sure that you take the journey with us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so when it comes time to put that into structure for a book, for example, do you change, is the process of compiling it for a book still very feminine, or does it require another aspect of yourself?
My process of making a book, I dump all of my poems in a Word document and I go through and I see, okay, which ones are saying the same thing? Is there one that's stronger here? Should I mix and match the lines? Which ones are a full yes? Is this the most honest way I could have phrased this? And then from there, I'll kind of go in and reorder them depending on what story I feel like there is, if I want to do sections or, what the through line is. So I'm a lot more meticulous about that.
So that's really interesting. I hadn't heard that before. So you actually, as you're putting together the book, will take your poems and edit your poems as if you're editing a book, the poems that were previously done until you decided to put them into the book.
Yes, because there's some, like I said, that will repeat themselves and say the same thing, but maybe aren't as strong, because also I share maybe 30% of my work online. There's so many other poems just in my notes app waiting. And so
30% for me, by the way, is so much. Like I think relative to what I actually output, because I don't have a book, so I'm not sharing from the book, what people have seen of my poetry is probably less than 10%.
That's a good thing though.
Yeah. I'm excited. It has me excited. And so, yeah, continue.
Yeah, because you've put so much love into this project, and I don't know, I'm excited for you because when you hold your book in your hands for the first time, there's nothing like it. Yeah. So I go back over and I think about what would actually serve the book, because what is written for the format of social media is very different than reading it and holding it in your hands. I won't change the integrity of the piece. I'm not trying to over polish or over perfect it. I'm more so looking for repetitive themes, repetitive imagery. If something could have been a little more honest, things like that.
And so then how do you relate to how long ago the piece was written? So you wrote that piece originally, let's say a year before. You're in a very different space, but now you're compiling it for the book and you're going, okay, well, how do you get back into the energy of that piece? Or do you actually say this will be served by the energy of who I am now?
No, like I said, I won't change the integrity of the piece. So I do put myself in the place I was when I wrote it. And that's something I've had to practice a lot with spoken word poetry, where a poem will go viral, it becomes a favorite, I get asked to perform it at an event, and I don't want it to just sound nice. I want it to be viscerally felt in my body, because I know that's how it's going to touch the audience, is if I am moved by my own words. But I'm in a different place now. So how do I make this an adventure every single time? Sometimes it's going back in time. Sometimes an old poem relates to me in a new way. So that's more of a muscle of just really opening yourself up and feeling what the weight of those words mean.
Yeah. And that's, I mean, the art of performing is very different than just the writing process itself. Those are two very different things.
Yeah.
A lot of people don't know that I was an actor in Los Angeles here for a decade. So,
Oh, that makes sense why you're so good at spoken word then.
so I trained basically conservatory style acting training. I was in professional theater, you know, all of that for many, many years. And so there's I bring that to, and it's a big part of how I got into poetry. So I was actually at an event in Santa Monica, and there were speakers, and they got 5 minutes. And so there was 12 speakers that all went and had 5 minutes to deliver a talk. And it was just in this guy's house, and he called them Fred Talks. And the last person to go was a spoken word poet. And I had never heard performance poetry for whatever reason, or I'd never clocked it. It just never stuck. But as soon as that person went, I immediately had a lightning bolt go off, and I said, I can do that. Yeah. I know I can do that. And I went home and wrote a poem, which is called Our Thoughts, which is the first one on my first album, Permission. And I came to my friends the next day and I said, can I read you guys a poem? And that now people go, yes, I would love to hear your new poem. But
at the time, they're like, oh God.
At the time, a bunch of dudes looking at me going, okay, dude, sure. Yep. We need to light some incense? What are we going to do here? And so getting over that, this isn't cool moment. And then I shared this poem, and one of my friends, I always name him by name because he changed my life, Christopher Pitcher, who left he said, oh yeah, that's really great. And then he left the room, and then divine spoke through him somehow, because he re-entered the room. He peeks his head out and he says, your next one should be called You Are Who You've Been Looking For. And then he leaves the room. And for those of you listening right now, You Are Who You've Been Looking For is the most viral live poem performance in history. It's been viewed over 250 million times. And it's what blew up my social media and kind of, it changed my life. And it was the second poem I ever wrote as a performance piece, because I went home from that and I thought, why not? That's as good of a prompt as any. And I wrote it over the course of the next 48 hours. And years later, it would go viral. And so this idea of where things come from, the ideas, the inspiration that we get, and then that part of me that was a performer. So when I saw someone do performance poetry, it wasn't just the poetry, it was the performance part. I get so lit up by performing my poetry in a way that, I'm a Leo rising, and I'm a bit of a wounded little boy who didn't get enough attention and all of that. The performing of the poetry is as rewarding as writing it in so many ways. It's its own version of that. Do you feel similarly now, having stepped in? Because I remember, I think when we talked, you hadn't really started performing your poetry so much. And so now you're being requested to do that. How do you relate to the performing aspect of your poetry?
Well, first of all, I want to acknowledge you for just saying, hey, can I share a poem and write it? And it seems like it's almost a similar journey of not knowing the magnitude of what your work will, create. And I think that's something for anyone who's beginning a craft to really recognize, is you have no idea where this thing can take you. And all you have to do is just keep going. Like, you wrote a poem that touched that many people. I mean, that's how I found you, first of all. And that just takes a lot of courage. So yeah.
Thank you.
That. Yeah. Performing is terrifying. I'm not like you. I was not an actor. I was not a performer. I was painfully shy growing up. It is very against my nature, or it was, I should say. Now it's a muscle I've exercised enough. But what I like about it is very little of me is actually there in those moments at all. I pretty much black out. And it's what I said, that other force that I'm so devoted to comes through. And for a moment, I feel like I'm a part of it all. And it's the greatest feeling in the world. And I love the Poetry Lounge because the lights are dark. I can't see any faces. I'm like, this is a dream for me. But I like feeling like I've surrendered myself that much to something. So that's what it is for me.
So I relate to surrender through the lens of surrendering is an action of trusting. Simultaneously, when you say I surrender, it's not giving up. It's I trust blank, whatever that is. I surrender my life. I surrender the outcome. I'm saying I trust life. I trust God. I trust whatever. I surrender my heart to another is me saying I trust you with my heart. And so when you say that surrender, that relationship, what are you trusting in?
I'm trusting in life to carry me because it's really not about the audience's reaction. For me, it's about how I feel inside during the experience. Did I break open? Was it honest? Or did it just sound nice? Did I do that for an Instagram video? Or did I do that because that's exactly how I feel right now? And I need to share it. I need to give it away to get it out of my body. Like, why am I doing this? And I have to constantly check in with myself every performance because my goal is to not perform when I'm performing, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. It's so that aspect for me was something that I had to learn through years and years and years of acting training because you can imagine now I'm not sharing my own words. I'm sharing this script or this character that someone else wrote that is saying things in a way that I wouldn't probably speak it and is feeling a way that isn't from a place that I was truthfully feeling when it was written, the way that my poetry is. So to learn how to, in a moment, be authentic with someone else's words, someone else's emotions, someone else's whatever wrapped into it, took some time. And then now I need to be able to do that thing over and over and over again, whether it's in a play that you do 20 times or whether it's just different takes where they move the camera for a close-up and now we're going to do 5 takes of that up close and then we're going to do 5 takes of it over there and we're now going to do it over here on you, but I need to give you the emotion you need to still be able to do your thing. And so the process of finding the truth anew over and over and over is one that took a lot of work and yet is so apropos to something that can be brought to life, to this conversation right now. How do I, as someone who is recording a bunch of podcasts in a short window of time, how do I arrive in the present moment with a conversation around creativity, fully present, fully anew with all of myself in each and every moment? And I think that what I love about poets specifically is poets have a way, and you have this 100%, which is you can speak to the most mundane of moments in a way that makes it feel as if it's magic. And so is that how you actually view it on a day-to-day, or does that come in when you step into poet mind? Are you always in poet mind? Because I'll say for myself, there is a lot of times that I go into entrepreneur mind. I do a lot. We've mentioned off this recording about the work ethic that I have is when I'm in entrepreneur mind, I can lose that sense of wonder and awe for the moment. But when I'm in poet mind, I could write a sonnet about my meal, you know?
Yeah, and yet you're in the same house eating the same meal. And so I think it's whether your mind is open or closed, like you said, because I experienced that too, where, I'm not necessarily feeling the wonder of being alive when I'm writing an email or when I'm working. That's also a very masculine energy for me that I'm in. And so they're 2 different parts of my brain. I have to transition, like you said, and get into that poet mind, which to me is really just being present and being in my heart and being with how I feel and noticing the world around me, because even if I'm in the same place, it's not the same moment.
Do you have practices that you do that bring you into poet mind?
Anything that puts me in my body, honestly, you know, dancing, going for a walk, just stepping outside. I have to get out of my head because I can be very cerebral.
And so what is it like now from a business standpoint for you? There's a lot of people listening to this who, as you said, there are so many poets who go unnoticed. And I am just now, by the time this comes out, it'll already be live, but I'm in the midst of the launch of my new brand building for creatives program, specifically helping creatives build their brand, because it breaks my heart to see how many epic creatives just don't understand how to truly build a brand. Now, you have one, and I'm curious how you relate to the business side of it, where people listening to this dream of being in the position you have of multiple books and community and all of these things. How do you navigate your sensitive, creative, feminine approach to your art with building actual business that sustains you?
It's what I said in the beginning. You have to separate the commercial industry from your art and realize how impersonal it is. You know, I don't think I'm the chosen one when it comes to why I have a big following. I think I was consistent and I kept going and I practiced my craft. And that would be the number one thing I'd say is practice your craft. Be as honest as you can with every thought, with every feeling. Keep writing, keep going. So that way you're preparing for when your moment does come. And no one really knows where that is. You know, the more you show up, the more lottery tickets you get, the better of a chance you have. But at least if you're in a place with your art that you're really proud of and that you feel confident in, you'll be ready for whatever it is. And there are practical tips for brand building. I'll leave that to you. Seems like your expertise. But I think it's just that, try and separate it, because it's not a reflection of who you are as an artist or how good you are at all. There are plenty of popular things that maybe aren't very good, and there are plenty of really unpopular things that are masterpieces. So they're different things.
And so how do you evaluate your art? Because I'll say there are things that I write and I go, that's just not as good. Like that one's just not as, that's a poem. It's cool, but it's not as good. And I have the ones that I put on the pedestals. What's funny is the one that went super viral, right? To your point about just showing up and keep buying the lottery tickets. For anyone listening to this, that poem was the second one that I ever wrote. I developed a show called Permission to Think Freely, which I toured internationally, Canada, the US, Australia, losing money because I had less than 5,000 Instagram followers and I would do it to shows of 30 people. Why the hell I went to Australia to do it? Don't ask me, but I just would book out these things, not even know the venue because I had someone in Australia that would help me try and book these things. And I lost money, but I just had to. The artist in me had to do it. And so I'd been doing this to no audience, and I went to an event, Kyle Cease, Evolving Out Loud. I'm there. I get pulled on stage randomly by him, synchronistically by him, to deliver a poem because I'd raised my hand. He called on me, and I was speaking to him about how I wanted to share this poem. He's like, come up on stage, share this poem. And I get on stage and I deliver to 1,500 people this poem that they re-recording from 8 different angles that they cut together, that I then shared online, that Goalcast found and then said, can we make a version of this? And that has gone on to be viewed 250 million times. Mm-hmm. It wasn't my event. It wasn't my cameras. It wasn't my edit. It wasn't even on my platform that it was ultimately shared for it to go viral. And what I was, though, was ready. The poem was memorized. I'd been pursuing my art, sharing it with the world at the literal cost of my time, my energy, my money. And I think that to your point, we have to show up ready for our moment because we never know when that moment will come. And so I'm curious how you stay ready, how you stay ready for that moment. How do you relate to, I was asking you about the business aspect as well, and just you obviously need to separate it, and you have your business mind and your poet mind, I guess. But how do you stay ready for what you're calling in life as a creative?
I keep writing. That's really it. I keep writing.
So simple.
Yeah. I think people want like a magical secret of, oh, how did you do this? And that's why I try and break the chosen one thing. I'm like, no, it's really just keep going. That's it. And my most viral video, same thing. It's like a joke. It was a random moment in time, someone else's camera. It's like you said, it is so out of your control. But what's in your control is that you work on your craft. And it's not about mastering it and being perfect and being the best. I look at it like a lifelong marriage. I am devoted to this craft for a lifetime because I love it. I would do it if 0 people read my work, and I really mean that.
So I had someone else on this podcast, Blue, who said that for her, the sharing of it is the other half. So the writing of it, she said, is half the circle. And the sharing of it is where the circle completes. And if, from her perspective, if it's not shared, if it's just stuffed in a drawer somewhere, that it never actually completes the circle. And that's really interesting because how I relate to that is that there's growth to be had from the sharing. Mm-hmm. That's a different type of growth, and it's its own journey that you can choose to take. But I write for me. And so even if I didn't share it, I won't get this growth over here, but it has its own validity. And I hadn't seen it or known even that other artists might relate to the sharing as being an integral part. How do you feel about now actually putting it out into the world, even if it's just sharing it with a friend?
I think the sharing is when it stops being for you and it becomes an offering. Mm-hmm. And that's how I look at it. It is a little difficult, honestly, because it's such a vulnerable craft. And, building a brand is real. That's a real thing. Being consistent is real. Numbers are real, all of these things. And eventually, ideally when you have your moment, the art does give back to you monetarily. And that starts to happen too. But then the problem is once there's a price tag on our art, there's a new added pressure that comes in versus what you were doing when you first started writing. You're just exploring, you're writing a poem, you're like, hey guys, can I share this thing? I just tried this new thing. And now it's a career and a profession. And so the way that I combat that and make sure my relationship to it stays healthy is I'm always a new student at something. I practice dance because I'll never make a career out of it. Mm-hmm. I'm going to start the violin.
Why the violin?
It's my favorite instrument. I just love it.
Interesting. What is it that you love so much about the violin?
It makes me cry every time I hear it.
Got it.
I don't know
it's
why.
the emotion. There's so much emotion in the violin.
Yes.
I was wondering if that was it. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel it in my heart. And I believe all creativity comes from the same place, whether you're dancing or painting or singing. And so I feel like I'm keeping myself in that open-minded new student space, no matter how far I go in my career as a poet. So that's my way of balancing it. Because for me, especially as an introvert, a part of me would love to just keep it all inside. Mm-hmm. But I know that's not my work. For me, standing on stage feels vulnerable. Standing in the spotlight feels vulnerable. That's where my soul is stretching the most right now because it's not my initial instinct.
And so I think it's so hilarious because everything that you're saying is what's calling me right now. So I've been nomadic for 6 years. I have not had a lease anywhere. I've been traveling pretty heavily. And what I'm so excited to do is settle down in one spot because I want to start taking dance classes and I want to get a piano. Piano for me is the one where I just can see myself hitting some chords and saying some poetry. Like I can do my own soundtrack underneath my poetry. Mm-hmm. And I believe I could dance probably like Justin Bieber. I really do. I think I can make it happen.
For you.
Yeah, I actually feel like I can do the whole pop and lock sort of thing.
With your cool hat, you're ready to go.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I really think I got that. And I approach it very holistically as well. So I used to be a personal trainer. And the body for me growing up was never a safe space because I had a repressed memory of abuse stored in my body that I wasn't aware of. And so now the body has become an integral part of how I view being fully aligned and able to do what I do. And so as an example, when I think about being in a heavily poetic time in my life where I'm writing a lot of poetry and I'm deep in my feels, I have to balance that out. by getting into boxing or jujitsu, something heavily masculine and primal, to kind of round it out. And I'm curious if you have an approach to when you feel yourself getting out of balance. Do you find yourself getting pulled too deeply in this direction or this direction? Or do you find that it's actually, going back to your previous answer of just, actually, I get back in my body and it all takes care of itself?
Do you mean in regards to being in your masculine or feminine, or going too far into one craft?
I mean just that feeling of being balanced. And so, yes, masculine and feminine to some degree, but I know, for example, when I've gotten really imbalanced with work. I know when I've gotten really imbalanced with work. I can feel it. And oftentimes what's difficult about that is I've already created so much inertia from that now I have like probably another 3 weeks of what I've lined up but by the time I realize it, but it could also be, wow, I'm just really too much in my into the physical, like I'm obsessed about this physical thing that I'm in, and I'm realizing I've gotten disconnected from my spiritual practices. And so finding that and adjusting and navigating, I'm curious how you relate to this idea of balance, if it's even a thing or if you embrace it fluidly.
I think it's a little bit of what you spoke to, where your body is a message board and you can feel it when you've gone too far with one thing, but also we're in a capitalist society and we're doing our best. And, there's certain elements required for freedom. Like there's an enormous amount of discipline required to actually create freedom. And so sometimes losing balance for a while is balance, because then you can swing back the other way and swing, and then eventually it just hits center. But I tend to just follow the direction that feels good to move in, whether that's, okay, I'm going to focus on work for a little while, so that way eventually I'll have more freedom and time to dedicate myself to my art. And so I also understand sacrificing one thing for a future ideal or dream. But I do think you have to pay attention. Like, I write first thing every morning, and I meditate first thing every morning, and I make sure there's at least a small little window where I'm connecting to myself before I go off in my day, because there is an element of like, oh, I'm not even here right now. I'm not even in my body. So I can't hear those messages if I've gone too far over an edge.
And when you say you write every morning, is it just an open journaling? Yeah.
Journaling, sometimes a poem comes out of that. Yeah.
Your poems, a lot of them feel like journal entries, very much so. And do you have a consistent, I journal in 4 ways. So one is just how I'm feeling in that moment. This is like what I'm feeling. The second way is a conversation. So I'll ask a question and allow it to come through me. So more of a channeling. And then I'll also have more poetic. So this is a poem would be a form of doing that. And then that fourth way is actually eluding me now, which tells me I haven't done it in a while. But the exploration of a topic, I think, is the fourth one, where I actually just decide to explore a topic for myself, whether that's love or whether that's creativity. Or I'll often do this when I'm prepping for a master class that I'm leading or whatever. I say, okay, this master class that I've said I'm going to do is around brand building. Now, let me just explore what that means to me and really dive into it. And so there's these different ways that I'll use journaling, and sometimes it'll shift and I'll notice the shift. So I'll be journaling about how I feel in the moment, and suddenly the tense changes and I go from I to you. And suddenly I realize I'm receiving something as opposed to outputting in a really interesting way. Do you have, how do you journal? What is your journaling practice like?
That was very articulate. My journal is a complete mess.
I'm a double Capricorn. So
You seem very structured.
putting structure around, so I'm a double Capricorn, double Pisces. So putting structure around emotions and love and creating understanding of these esoteric concepts and understanding myself through giving structure. It seems counterintuitive to a lot of creatives, but for me, everything is actually an algorithm. So binary code, masculine, feminine, alpha, omega, yin, yang, zeros and ones, circles and lines. That is what creates this. So ultimately, at the core of everything we are experiencing, there is a algorithm, and what we call entropy is just an algorithm too complex for us to comprehend at that time. Just like when we as an individual say, I don't know why I behaved this way. I don't know when my partner says this, why I respond in anger. But with a little bit more understanding, maybe that's is a couple more data points. Maybe it's a different way of framing the conversation. Whatever it is, when we get enough data and we can be shown the algorithm, suddenly it's like, oh, this to this to this to this. We live in a linear world, which means that logic just is ever present because logic is the expression of linearity. It's just point A to point B to point C. And so for me, breaking even what I'm explaining now down into a functional linear pattern is the deepest way that I can get to the code that runs reality. And so I do love to find the structure because I don't find it limiting. I find it just as a different expression of the language of creation.
Interesting. You find structure to be more liberating. I could see that. I think with my journals, it's similar to what you're saying, where it's all of those components. It's just not broken down in my mind in that way. I think a writer lives twice. First, we're just experiencing. And secondly, we're capturing the beauty of being alive in different moments. And so my journal is that second life where I try in as much detail as possible to pierce through the moment. How did I feel? What did I smell? What sounds were there around me? You know, what was the expression on someone's face? Did I notice like a flicker of sadness in their eyes? Was there a genuine smile on their face? And it's an observational practice of noticing and trying to not do it from a judgmental way, but from the writer perspective, from third person, almost like I'm, you know, kind of God hovering above it all, just witnessing it, because I also really value memories in my life so much. Like, I just hope when it is my time, I look back and I'm like, wow, like I lived. There's so much beauty there. I've collected so many gems and so many wonderful people. And so I don't want to forget it. And that's why I'm very meticulous. It's more writing about my experiences. And sometimes I'll extract a concept and I'll be like, oh, here we go. And that's probably why they read like journal entries a lot of the time. But I think for me, it is almost, it almost comes from a fear of letting life slip through my fingertips because I was really disassociated for the first part of my life. And so that's my practice of staying in real time with it all.
Is that the disassociation, is that the result of trauma early on?
Yeah.
Got it.
Definitely. And I've done so much work around that to be here. And the poetry is a huge, huge part of that. But because I was numb for a large portion of my life, I really, really value my emotions. And I really value the people in front of me and around me in a completely different way because I know what it's like to just sleepwalk through my life.
What was the shift, the catalyzing moment for you that shifted you? Was there one moment where you realized, wow, I just came back into my body? Or was it a gradual chipping away at the disassociation?
The first time I became aware of it, I was 18 and I signed up for this craniosacral therapy training, and it was all women in their 50s and 60s, and I signed up online. So when the trainer met me in person and saw how young I looked, she's like, you can't do this. This is deep trauma work. What are you doing here? Like, go to college. And I was like, no, I'm doing this. Like, I have to. I don't know why I have to. Similar to how you spoke on going on tour. So I was in a 9-month training with these women. And I think having older women with an experience gap and a wisdom gap for me, and seeing an example of what it looks like when a woman is fully in her body. Like, I have a line that says the woman who feels the most contains the most life. And I think sometimes we feel crazy for that because there's so much happening inside of us, like this chaotic ocean. But that was the first time I saw an example of it being beautiful and powerful and realized that I wanted that for myself. And there wasn't one magical moment where, I took some mushrooms and was like, I'm here now. It was a constant practice of leaning into discomfort and leaning into, I'm not going to die from emotional pain. It's okay to be here.
The moment for me of having in 2 back-to-back ayahuasca ceremonies, having this memory of being molested when I was 5 come back to me was the first time in my entire life that I didn't feel like a stranger in my own body. And when I was shown the memory, the first thing that happened in the ceremony is I started crying, sobbing, tears of gratitude, because it felt as if my life finally made sense for the first time. And to even be able to say that I felt like a stranger in my own body is funny because I can only say that in hindsight. I didn't even know that's what I had been feeling. And so in my journey, there was a distinct moment of finally going, I can be in my body. Not because I'm devoid of the pain and the sadness and the PTSD and all of that that's actually present, but because I actually can see it now. I'm not running. I'm not afraid of whatever this is in the background, in the closet of my own being. It's here now. It's present, and I can be with that. And poetry and acting, speaking to acting, the reason why I got into acting was because it was the only place that emotions were safe to feel. In my household, it wasn't safe. In my body, it wasn't safe. But acting, not only was it safe to emote, but the more you could connect to your emotions, the better you were and the more you were rewarded for it. And so for me, that was the pressure release valve. And then poetry became that. When I moved away from acting and I started writing poetry, suddenly I could write a poem and deliver it to someone. And if I was sharing it and it brought me to tears, I wasn't embarrassed. I saw that it was impacting them even more because I'm sharing so deeply from myself.
Yeah.
And to know that you at 18 years old were starting that journey of coming back into your own body and being able to use poetry in that way is mind-blowing to me. What was it that, like, how did you become an 18-year-old that would do that? Where was that a part of even your reality? Because at 18 years old, I was doing cocaine off of Jack Daniel's bottles. like I don't understand.
That's the normal experience.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if it's normal, but definitely, yeah.
Yeah. By society standards, that's way more normal.
Totally.
I've always been weird. Like, my first job was a teen-to-teen suicide hotline from 13 to 18.
Wow.
And I think as a result of deep trauma, sometimes what happens is you want to understand people and the world around you. And so some of the most messed up people become healers or facilitators in that way. And so I don't think I was aware of this, but I was really, really trying to understand, one, how to be in my own body. Like you said, that line really hit me, being a stranger in your own body, because that's how I felt. If you haven't written a poem called that, you should. But 2, I also wanted to have compassion for people with mental illness. And yeah, so I don't know. I mean, I found a journal from when I was 9, and one of the lines was like, we're all just borrowing these bodies until we become dust again. Like, when I said I was awkward in the beginning, I really am awkward. Like, I'm a strange human being, and I always have been. And it was hard making friends growing up, and that's why I got into reading. I loved books so much because, similar to how you're describing acting, I could safely go on all of these adventures and I could safely feel all of these emotions, but it wasn't my life. And so it didn't matter,
Well, I'm so grateful that we've had the opportunity to dive into this. I'm going to land the plane a little bit as our hour is coming to a close. The piece that I want to know now for you is, having had so many years of continuing to develop your craft and seeing it as a craft and having a relationship, I feel very aligned with how you view it as well. And I look at it through also the lens of being 26 and approaching your Saturn return, which I'm sure you've heard about and are familiar with. What's next for you? Do you look, how far forward do you look in terms of what you're creating for your life and the role, the visions that you have versus you strike me as such a person of presence and just enjoying the moment as is. And me, the double Capricorn, designing a whole empire building over the next decade or whatever it might be. I'm curious where you fall in that and creatively what's next for you.
Yeah, I mean, it's the yes and I'm very present, and it doesn't feel very good to just float aimlessly. So I definitely do have dreams and ideas of when I want to create, because I also think of that Maya Angelou quote of there's no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside of you. And so I have a lot of books that I plan to write, and actually a spoken word album I want to make, and to travel and perform more, and this fantasy book coming out. And there's like all of these creative dreams that I want to have realized, but I try and hold everything very, very loosely, but dearly, where I'm cherishing it. But if the course changes, that's okay. It's part of the surrender.
Okay. And having listened to you over this conversation, I feel a renewed sense of, what would the word be? Just a renewed sense of appreciation for the relationship I have to my art. That understanding that this creative path is such a gift. The fact that we get to live a life where we can feel as deeply as we can, transmute that in the most beautiful way that feels authentic in the moment, and life has now orchestrated it where we're rewarded for that, is such a gift. And so I thank you for bringing that gift to me today through this conversation. And I'm wondering if you would be willing to land the plane for us with another poem and close it out, if you're open to that.
Sure.
I'm going to give you the opportunity to step into that edge and perform it. Before doing that, because I think that'll be a beautiful way to close, will you let people know how they can find you, follow you, and all of those goodies? Because you're going to have a book that by the time this comes out is either just came out or is just on the verge of coming out, and I want people to get it.
Yeah, it's a fantasy book. It's called Legends of Lemuria. It's available on Thought Catalog. You could also find it on my Instagram, which is Allie Michelle L, and that's about it. That's where you can find me.
There it is. Simple. Yeah. Amazing. Is there anything else before we go into the poem that you would like to say that feels at the top of your heart, that you want to leave people with?
Just keep going. Just keep writing. It's really it. Your moment will come. I have no idea when or how, but if you keep going, it'll come. Mm. Yeah.
Beautiful. Yeah. And what poem would you like to leave us with today, Allie?
What mood are we in?
Oh, what mood are we in?
Yeah.
Well, let's mirror the journey of your 3 books. I think empowerment. It's a good space to leave us with.
I'm trying to think of when I have memorized. Okay. I actually have one about women that I wrote recently. And it kind of is on theme with what we've been talking about a little bit.
Beautiful. Okay. Stage is yours.
The woman who treats herself as a queen has her chin held high and her heart wide open. She cannot be brought to her knees because she already lives her life in prayer. The woman who feels the most, contains the most life, the most wisdom. She understands her emotions to be the language of spirit speaking through her. The woman who trusts her inner voice over 1,000 outside opinions. She follows it with relentless grace. The woman who knows that her body is a portal between two worlds. She understands it to be a direct line to God and does not allow it to become an escape or burial ground for the pain of others. The woman who seeks counsel from every generation of women. She treasures their voices and hears their wisdom. The woman who knows the value of surrender. She trusts her soul in painting its own path. This woman is a queen. She's you, and she's me.
Thank you, Allie Michelle.
Thank you, Adam.
Appreciate you so much. And thank you, everybody who went on this poetic exploration down the creative path with us today. Please go check out Allie's book and everything else that she's got going on. And I encourage you to please share this out with the world. Let us know, tag us on social media. Let us know what resonated most with you. And as always, in all ways, I want to remind you that you are seen, you are heard, and you are loved.
Any person who is as adept as you are in poetry is a mathematician. You are using, different mathematical geometric forms in language. You just don't know that you're doing it, right? And you could say that music is just geometry that we listen to. And by, the same token, you could say that geometry is just the music that we listen to with our eyes.